Hello, everybody, and welcome to our event towards decolonizing settler-led water advocacy and protection. My name is Megan Clout. I use she, her pronouns, and I am pleased to be here to learn alongside you today. I'm the communications manager for the Wellington Water Watchers and will be your host for this event. We will start off today by taking some time to reflect on the lands and waters that sustain us and the first stewards of these lands. I am joining from the traditional Anishinaabeg territory on the ancestral lands of the peoples of Nipissing and Doki's First Nations, whose Aboriginal and treaty rights are recognized by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and have lived on these lands since time immemorial. I would like to take a moment to express my gratitude to the Indigenous leaders and allies who I've had the privilege to learn from and am continuing to learn from. As we are joining here together online, coming from places across this region, I encourage you all to take a moment to quietly express your gratitude to the lands you are joining from and to the Indigenous people who are the traditional stewards of these lands. I invite you to take time to reflect on the systems and structures that some of us benefit from at the expense of others, and the ways in which colonialism is one of the ongoing problems contributing to the climate crisis. I encourage you to express your gratitude to the Indigenous land keepers who hold a deep and meaningful relationship with the lands and waters that support all life. I invite you now to take a quiet moment to reflect and acknowledge the lands and waters that sustain your life.
Water, you heal me. Water, let me heal you. Water, take my love. Remember my love. Water, you heal me. Water, let me heal you. Water, know my love. Remember my love. Water, you heal me. Water, let me heal you. Water, hold my love. Remember my love.
I'm now pleased to introduce our moderators for today, Hannah and Lindsay. Hannah's transdisciplinary master's research intersects chemical engineering, cultural anthropology, and environmental science using Indigenous research methodologies to harmonize Western science with Indigenous knowledge. She aspires to weave together the validity of peer-reviewed science with the fluidity of Indigenous wisdom to examine holistic approaches to addressing climate change and water contamination, governance, and insecurity issues. Lindsay Potts is a wildlife naturalist with Junction Creek Stewardship Committee in Nosakama and co-founder of Canoe for Clean Water, with a background in freshwater fish conservation and a fierce commitment to the lands and waters that have raised, nurtured, and grounded her. She is looking forward to learning alongside other settlers moving towards decolonization within water work and building a community of support and accountability. Welcome, Hannah and Lindsay.
Thank you all for joining us. Before turning it over to our distinguished panel of non-experts, Hannah and I are just going to take a moment to set the context for this event and share the story that brought us here today. So in the fall of last year, Wellington Water Watchers hosted an event called Watersheds 2020, which was an online convention that brought together people in Ontario that were passionate about water protection and water justice. At this event, two fierce Indigenous water advocates, Wasekombe and Dr. Kelsey Leonard, offered two resounding and loud and vocal and direct signposts to all attendees. The first was to deepen our relationship, our personal relationship with water. And the second was to center Indigenous voices in all of our work. But what does that actually look like? How do Canadians or settlers pick up our responsibilities to the water and to Indigenous peoples? When we talk about truth, reconciliation, decolonization, sovereignty, settlers, allyship, what does that actually mean? So one thing at least I've noticed about settlers is that we certainly have a lot of questions. As you've no doubt noticed, or you will be soon introduced, The people that are presenting here today and the people that organize this conversation are all non-indigenous. This is intentional. This is a settler designed event for a settler audience. And this really emerged from conversations within Wellington Water Watchers community of practice and with Indigenous folks that we are in relationship with to take responsibility for educating ourselves. This is especially important ahead of tomorrow's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Our hope is that by providing space for freshwater groups and community members to learn from, support, and build accountability with each other, we can move forward together and avoid overburdening Indigenous educators. So wherever you are in this journey, this really is an invitation and an encouragement. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Hannah. Thank you all for being here.
Megan, and thank you, Lindsay, for setting some context for where this conversation stemmed from. The little part I want to add here is just maybe more of the Zoom logistics, but in an intentional way in the space that we're trying to create here today. So please be careful with the language that you use when you're asking these questions. We appreciate and welcome your curiosity and encourage that those conversations to occur, but words are powerful and can be harmful. So please keep it safe and kind. You may also choose to be anonymous when you submit these questions, entirely up to those in the audience. Only us as the moderators, panelists, and our internal team can see those questions. Again, like Lindsay said, we're in a process, so we're, we recognize we're in a vulnerable space and we want to meet everyone where they're at. So in order to provide full transparency to our audience, we may group together similar questions in order to address more of them in the most meaningful way possible. So if you don't see your exact question asked, we've probably cataloged it in a way that works with the other questions. As well, perhaps not all questions or comments will be addressed just pertaining to the time, but we will be harvesting and deeply considering these for future conversations. As well, depending on how these questions are submitted, they may also be reframed in a way that doesn't create further harm if they are submitted in a way that we feel shouldn't be presented on in the space today. And again, just to touch on the chat function here, Megan did mention it's disabled today, but that was again intentional. We recognize that there's a benefit to having this collective experience, but we've decided to keep the distractions to a minimum, and we invite you to deep listening today, as well as continuing into tomorrow. So the very last thing is not wanting to take away the ownership of the questions. These are all good conversations for us to all have, but we welcome you to also consider your positionality when asking these questions. So if you feel so called to, you may mention kind of where you're coming from in asking this question. For example, I could mention that I'm coming as a graduate student or a woman of color. Sometimes that helps kind of help the panelists see where you're coming from and answer your question from that perspective. So I will hand it back to Lindsay to introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Hannah. So our first panelist today is Paul Baines, and he's the Blue Community Coordinator for the Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph and a member of the Great Lakes Commons Initiative. With ancestry from British Isles, Paul has learned a lot from Indigenous water protectors across the Great Lakes on how to be in kinship relations with the waters and all of creation. Paul works mainly with other non-Indigenous people to unpack colonization and to take up our responsibilities on Turtle Island. Our next panelist is Arlene Slocombe, and she is the Executive Director of Water Watchers and lives in Ditch with One Spoon territory along the Eramosa River just outside of Guelph, Ontario. She is interested in continually deepening her personal relationship with water, centering Indigenous sovereignty, and searching for ways to facilitate decolonization, both personally and in all of her work. Finally, we're pleased to welcome Taylor Wilkes, who is a facilitator and disruptor at Our Living Waters, a project on Make Way's shared platform. Her participation is an effort to lean into invitations that alleviate educational burdens on Indigenous people and take up responsibility for evolving treaty relations.
Before we get into the panel, just so everyone knows, each of these panel members have been entrusted by their organizations to speak on these important topics, yet they do not speak on behalf of their organizations. We welcome you, Arlene, Taylor, and Paul. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Hannah and Lindsay, for setting the context so well, so carefully, so thoughtfully for this conversation we're having today. As mentioned, my name is Arlene Slocombe. I'm Executive Director of Water Watchers, and we're joining here today. We're at Paul's house near Peterborough on the Otonabee River here, at the waters that I feel so deeply connected to. I've had the privilege and the blessing to live along the Aramasa River just outside of Guelph area for many years, and I'm born and raised in that area and feel such a strong connection to those waters. And I'm going to take a breath here. I'm also just want to recognize that as Lindsay mentioned, those really important signposts were issued to us, delivered to us, requested, asked of us at an event last year. And it's been sitting so deeply in my heart, both of those ways to be in relationship with water personally, and in our work in centering Indigenous sovereignty. And one of the reasons why we've come together for this conversation is because in my work at Water Watchers, we are often working with many different grassroots campaigns and recognizing that all of us are at different places in our journey about what this conversation is, all about, and what it means to do that in our work of water advocacy. And this conversation has been brought together from my point of view, and as part of my introduction and my interest in this is to be really transparent, really vulnerable, really open, and welcoming the diversity of perspectives and where everyone in our folds is on this journey, and how we can work together as a collective to move ourselves closer to where those signposts are requesting us to be. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Arlene. Thanks to our moderators and Danny and Megan behind the scenes. Thanks everybody for joining today. We had quite a lot of interest in this discussion. It's not going to be the last part of it. There's a whole series, and this is a long journey that we are on. I'm Paul Baines, and most of what I'm going to speak about today and from is my experiences with the Great Lakes Commons, a bioregional initiative to look at the waters of the Great Lakes since 2012. And currently I'm working for the Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph, who in late 2017 pledged to become a blue community to protect water as a human right, a shared commons, and a sacred gift. So I wanted to add to my bio that was read from the top that I do live within the Otonabee watershed, the Otonabee water body, which is just near Nogajinmanong, also known as Peterborough, which is covered by the William Treaties, Treaty 20 in particular. This place is known as the Mishi-Sagik Nishnabeg territory, and it's my water work here is I aspire to sort of see how my water work is an act of reciprocity, healing, and even transformation while living here. I didn't go to school for most of this work. I have many teachers, and I wanted to read a bit of a list of some of my Indigenous teachers on my own journey since 2012. Wasaikam Nin, Tasha Beads, grandmother Josephine Mandaman Ba, Amy Kraft, Sherry Longboat, Karen Recollet, Pam Palmater, Hayden King, Jessica Keshag Martin, Deb Denard, Nancy Rowe, John Burrows, Doug Williams, Leanne Simpson, Jen Cole, Shirley Williams, Kelsey Leonard, Dorothy Taylor, Sharon Day, Layla George, Candace Day Naveau, Isaac Murdoch, Christy Belcourt, Mike Ornsby, and the list goes on. So I'm just humbled by the education that I've received and the experiences over these last years. And I hope to pass that on and reflect on that with you today and going forward. Taylor?
Before I introduce myself today, I want to acknowledge the ancestors and the spirits of this land in Mississauga territory. Thanks for introducing where we're at. The knowledge holders and elders in this territory who have kept that sacred knowledge safe against all odds in the last several hundred years. The generosity in this community of elders and knowledge holders in sharing what they know and how they understand the world has completely transformed the way that I live my life here and understand the world that we live in. And I'm very grateful to have been the recipient of some experiences in this space. So that said, I also want to thank the waters. The waters teach us and me as well. Specifically, I want to honor the water's ability to bring people together as we have done today, to be fluid and adapt to the environment and conditions that we're in, and her way of transforming very old, rigid structures. So I hope that we can hold those teachings in our heart for our conversation today. So my name is Taylor Wilkes. I'm born of the waters of Judith Mary Coke, of the waters of Enocha Haring, of the waters of Corey Kaniba, of the waters of Maria Yacoba Harrells. I come from two very long lines of colonial descent, Dutch and British. And each year, my understanding of how my Western worldview was founded and the influence it has on my life grows a little bit richer and more clear. I identify as someone who is categorized as white and benefits from our society that was designed to uplift people who are categorized as white. And I also identify as a treaty person in training. And so I came into this conversation early in my education, participating in the Indigenous Environmental Science program at Trent University. And I remember as a young environmentalist, I pursued that perspective, thinking it would make me a better scientist, a more holistic person in this work. But I left the program a better human being. And so ever since, I've been finding ways to weave those teachings into my environmental work. And I work on behalf of the waters now for an organization called Our Living Waters. We are a cross-country network for freshwater groups and NGOs, and we're specifically designed to support these groups in collaborating together better. We offer services and supports that generate more collaboration regionally and cross-country. So thank you so much, Arlene and Paul, for involving me in this discussion today. It was an invitation that was vulnerable, and I am going to do my best to speak from my heart and my intuition today.
Oh, thank you all for those beautiful words. So we invite everyone, if you'd like to put questions into the Q&A box, please do so. To start us off, we have a couple questions, and we also got some questions come through email. But obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of words that are thrown around, and depending on where you're at in that journey, they can be confusing, overwhelming, troubling. So I thought we'd put that out first. Some, I guess, definitions or understandings, how we frame some of these words that are maybe new to some of us, or some of us are continuing to explore. So the first word that I would invite panelists to reflect on comes from the title of this conversation today, which is Towards Decolonizing Settler-Led Water Advocacy and Protection. So I'm wondering if each of the panelists could speak to what the word settler means to you.
I got nominated to go first on this one. I'll do my best. I thinking about that term that's used in so many contexts. And so I think context really matters. Some people use it all the time. Some people have problems with it, people who are non-indigenous. And so my thinking about it would start with the fact that we need truth before we can move to reconciliation. and that there is a level of unsettling that is needed, rather than looking for affirmations of the status quo. Canada is a settler state. I live in a settler state. That's the truth. And so by that kind of context, I would classify myself as a settler. Everybody who lives in Canada, who's a Canadian, who is not subject to the Indian Act or to discrimination of the determination of the state, would be a Canadian, would be living in would be a settler in that way. While I think we're all treaty people in most parts of Canada, I do think it's important to address power relationships and our position within this colonial system, similarly to naming whiteness or male privilege, for instance. You know, there's this idea of being a settler, being a settler descendant, being an immigrant. And I think these are all ways in which we can position ourselves within the state. There's also settler organizations or settler institutions. For here, I would include the banks, the courts, the schools, the churches, the media, the police, and the list goes on. And so I do think it's important to point out that these are the institutions which shape and which sort of have the authority in Canada. And we're seeing how that's playing out in the news, and obviously the impacts of colonization. I also think there's what I would call settler thinking, or how settler is an ongoing process with us today, in which many of us have brought the old world here to Turtle Island in a sort of while being disenchanted, largely disenchanted from the land, being estranged from elders, from the lands and waters. And so thinking about the transition from forests to farms, and then farms to places called foodland, I think the process of settling Canada is not just in the past. I think it's an active thing today. So I would put settler into a verb, and that kind of thinking behind that. Lastly, I think this idea of being an immigrant, and that within non-indigenous category, there's a lot of power differences as well. And a book I'm reading called Healing Haunted Histories, A Settler Discipleship of Colonization by Elaine Enns and Chad Myers, for me, gives some bit more clarity over different types of immigrants, which, unless you're an indigenous, you are immigrant descent. And they break it into 4 brief categories: the colonist, the opportunist, the distressed immigrant, and the forced relocation. And for an example, the colonists may be the original explorers, militia, tradespeople, resource extractors, government officials, families under government contract, and in some cases, missionaries. These were what the authors would call not just immigrants, but colonists. Another category, which my own family would probably fit into, and that is the opportunists. Opportunist migration involves some degree of political and/or economic mobility, privilege, and agency from the old country to the new. But to be distinguished from a distressed immigrant, here people are pushed or pulled by forces beyond their control, usually political, but sometimes environmental, to leave home, to go somewhere else, attaining religious freedom. And lastly, they use the concept, or the sort of the analysis of forced relocation, where some immigrants, some Canadians, some people living in the settler state have to, when there's political or economic forces, kidnap them, traffic, or otherwise drive people across borders through war, ethnic cleansing, and slavery. And let's not forget, many indigenous peoples have experienced relocation by the settler state themselves. So I'll just offer that as some introductory thoughts to settler as a verb, as an ongoing process, to being a Canadian living in a settler state, and the various forms of power and positionality, even amongst immigrants.
Thanks, Paul. I think what I might add to that is just a little bit more to specifically around this event and the ways that we might use it for some of our lead-up events too, using the word settler. Mean that really purely as a descriptive term, meaning that that for myself, as an example, in my context as a settler, my long ancestry is not from these lands. It's from other lands. And that you know, we've had some questions, some really important questions come in around Is it intended to be a derogatory term? And I would say, no, it's not intended to be a derogatory term. And I can imagine that in some contexts, it might even feel that way. It's not intended to be that. It's purely descriptive in terms of our relationality with our long ancestry of the land. And that, though, I will add one further little piece, which is that as someone myself who recognizes my settler identity, I aspire and feel obligations and my full responsibilities as a treaty person. But as a settler, I have not always been educated in what that means. And in terms of as a settler organization, particularly from my point of view, when it comes to something like water advocacy, when water is like the lifeblood of the places and the source of life from where each one of us lives, to claim or aspire maybe into being a water advocate steps me more deeply into my treaty responsibilities. And from that perspective, when I look at settler identity, there's way more nuance in it. So that's the piece I'd like to add to that.
For me, these terms of settler or non-indigenous or identifying as white are all terms for our identity. And this work we're doing in working towards being able to have good relations and work together in a good way involves identity work of healing and learning and unlearning. And so it's really important to be doing that identity work. Each of us will identify in different ways according to how we've come into the conversation and what kind of healing we've done thus far, what our stories are. I see that it's both very important to be firm and strong in our identities so that we can be careful not to interfere or harm or take advantage of other identities. But I also see a slight risk in getting too caught up in identity politics and terminology and missing the point of what we had come to do together, which is work together in a generative way. And so I don't usually identify as a settler, but it also doesn't offend me if I'm referred to as a settler. It doesn't matter. I do descend from settler people, and I do recognize I live in a settler society, but I choose to identify as someone classified as white and who benefits from whiteness because it helps me remember in these social interactive settings that the color of my skin can come with the stereotypes of white people, the mistrust and the betrayal and the harm from the past. And so for me, that helps me remember in these social contexts that my presence impacts people and I need to be cognizant of that.
Thank you for those insightful answers. I think similarly, kind of jumping onto Lindsay's point, in the title of today's conversation, we also use the word decolonize. This in itself can be a really charged term. Not everyone can have a great understanding of what that means or, have different definitions of that. So I welcome you to also take a stab at maybe setting the stage for that word.
Okay. I'll take a stab at that. Thank you, Hannah. We were talking about this a little bit before the panel started, and Paul was saying, I'm just going to start with that. Paul was saying that it really isn't up to us to define this term. It's not up to colonizers to set out the prescript of what decolonization looks like. I have learned about this entirely through listening. And so I'm happy to offer what I've learned thus far from people who think about this really thoughtfully, like Amy Kraft. And so before we talk about decolonization, I think we need to talk about land. And we're not talking about land from a Western worldview of property and ownership and maybe pristine conserved wilderness or beloved parcels of property. We're talking about it, or I'm listening to people talk about it from Indigenous worldviews. And so the concept of land, from what I understand, is a much more holistic ecosystem of all beings in the world, all their responsibilities, their contributions to the perpetuation of life, and the interaction of all the beings in the land. And so it's a much more holistic, spiritful, relational, and responsible way of talking about the land. Before I say anything else, do you want to add to anything to that?
There's a mythologist I like named Martin Shaw, and he lives in England. And for me, he talks about being of a place rather than just being from a place. And so here, I guess I'm starting into a definition of what it means to be of indigeneity. And I think what decolonization should be doing is sort of striving towards being of a place. And, there was 2 signposts mentioned earlier on from our keynotes, from Wellington Water Watch's keynote event, Watershed 2020, in which we need to, as a process of decolonization, we need to be developing, I'd also add, enchanting our personal relationship with water, and we need to be centering Indigenous voices. But I think part of my role here today and the work that I do is also to question and unpack settler institutions and stories. That is a settler's responsibility to do. Online, I watched a video with one of the teachers I mentioned earlier, Isaac Murdoch, speaking about the statues, Sir John and Macdonald or Ryerson statue, and the discussion regarding them coming down. And I thought it was pretty revealing and on point when Isaac said that these are settlers' monuments. Settlers should take them down. Why are we, criminalizing or having to talk about the rightness or wrongness of Indigenous people taking these down when these are settler monuments? And so I feel like those kind of symbols and others are sites for settlers to decolonize and to, unpack and question, of course, but to shift resources, to build greater awareness for more action and to transform these institutions. And for me, the goal is to live in kinship relationship with Indigenous peoples, with all of creation, for lives past and for those yet to come. And so it's both, I guess, a concept of, for me, of unpacking and dismantling and transforming with these aspirational ideas regarding kinship and being of a place.
What I will case that within one succinct statement that it really helped me from a land back webinar a couple of months ago now with, I think the Narwhal hosted it. Amy Kraft was describing how returning the land and returning to the land are 2 sides of this same process, and everyone needs to be, from their own story and their own viewpoint, contributing to these processes of returning the land to Indigenous sovereignty and returning to the land with their culture and connection relationship. And so whatever that looks like for you can be guideposts in figuring out what decolonization looks like.
Yeah, thanks, you two. Yeah, what I might add to that too is just intentionally trying to use the word towards decolonizing as well, because I understand the importance, as well as both of you have mentioned, that it really isn't for us to define that, and we're in a process, and it's an ongoing process. And I just want, I'm thinking about the many ways that colonization shows up just in my person, in my personal being, being born into colonial structures, being raised in colonial structures, and becoming aware of those as I've on my learning journey myself, realizing how deeply infused colonial ways of being and colonial thinking is in my being, and how it becomes like a daily practice of maybe the word is unlearning, but also just of noticing, just of observing you know, there are some things that I can see in myself, and I can make this really personal to myself. Like there's an interest quickly to fix things. There's an interest quickly to a right or a wrong, or a kind of a binary way of looking at the world, or at problems, or at challenges. And those are impulses that come from my habituation in a colonial structure. So when I'm further thinking about decolonizing in tandem with like deepening the relationship with the land and original stewards, I'm just really paying attention to when those pieces show up for me. So when there's like a quickness to get into motion and a quickness to activate, not necessarily always, but it's a little bit of a little flag that can go up for myself. And I think, you know, further thinking around decolonizing is that it's not so much just a goal, an end goal. I think it's a practice. I think it's a practice, given there's been so many hundreds of years on the lead up of colonizing. It's a practice for decolonizing. And so towards it is what our aim is in our work. And I'm really cognizant that in our work, in water advocacy work, this is still a fairly young conversation. It's a fairly young conversation in my own being, to be really transparent, in terms of, you know, the long legacy of colonization that this being has evolved in. And it's a young conversation in our water advocacy work, and one that I'm really glad to be on a journey with. It feels significant, and it feels, you know, as mentioned several times already, those markers, those signposts, were gifts, where they were really important gifts to us at last year's watershed event. And we're working towards those always. So hopefully that's helpful a little bit.
Thank you all for sharing those thoughts. I think it's something that I definitely also reflect on, this word decolonize, and how, of course, like, it can't be settlers that define it. And I really like how Taylor emphasized that emphasis on listening, and listening deeply, and paying attention to our relationship with the land, for example. So while we're not maybe responsible for defining what decolonize means, we do have responsibilities to pay attention to these teachings that are shared with us, to perhaps act in our own institutions, as Paul brought up. So challenging statues, maybe that's where we hold some responsibility. And as Arlene mentioned, paying attention to our own being, and moments where these ideas that are really ingrained in us, these really colonial ways of being, show up in our daily lives. So that actually ties in really nicely with a lot of questions we've been getting. And I think there's a lot of nuance in recognizing our own responsibilities, when we can speak on issues and when we should be listening deeply. So we've got a couple questions that have come in about that. I'm gonna refer to one in particular. So for example, and I think this resonates and kind of picks up on the cues that are in a bunch of the questions. So the question is from someone who identifies as being confused about how to be a good ally. And I think that's probably something we all struggle with. So the question is, how do we help educate settlers, take responsibility for our own education, while still decentering white colonial history and not expect Indigenous people to do the work for us? So you've touched a little bit on this, but I think there's a lot of interest in really diving deeper on what settler responsibilities are, how we can be good allies, how we can educate people and move forward while not expecting Indigenous people to do that work.
Well, I'll just start it briefly with the brief little line, because it's a big one, you know, and we've been wondering how we're going to toss these around. But maybe just that this is a bit of an act of doing that. This is us coming together for you know, raising up, lifting up our own education on what this looks like, and that this is wherever each of us is at on this journey, to be in conversation and dialogue with one another, to take up our responsibilities, but also in our building and deepening of our relationships with Indigenous people that we might be working with, or in any other kind of relationship with, to really listen to what would allyship look like to them. That seems central, rather than making a whole lot of assumptions on our part. I'll just put that out there first.
I'll add a little bit in. I think it's the big question, and I think going back to Arlene's answer to the last question was resisting the temptation. This is advice for myself, especially, to jump in and act right away. That we need to again repattern those tendencies because our bodies and minds and souls have kind of been patterned in a colonial way. I think being a good ally would start with being very grounded for where you are. I think some of the anxiety, let's say for white people or for non-indigenous people, is that there is this anxiety is real, and for some it's a barrier. And I think that the more grounded one is in terms of where they stand, is a key part to just that way you won't feel as easily knocked off your game when presented with challenges. And I think part of that is the increasing formulation and articulation of land and water acknowledgements that individuals and organizations are doing. This is not so much as an outcome, but as a process of unlearning and connecting. And I also believe in moving at the speed of trust building Indigenous relationships over time. There is lots of reasons for there not to be trust because of the broken responsibilities that non-Indigenous people have perpetuated and their institutions have perpetuated. And so I do think being grounded and moving at the speed of trust would be fitting no matter what kind of allyship you were trying to seek in whatever sort of position, be you a educator or a working at an NGO or a researcher or a parent, whatever role you were playing, those would be pretty universal in from my perspective.
Another aspect of allyship that was a bit later learned for me was how not to get in the way. I think I've been asking myself this question about how to be an ally and for a long time now. And I think the best way of learning has been in community for me. Once I started developing a community of other people asking these questions and talking about these ideas, more resources came to me, and it sort of evolved naturally. So when you start putting this energy out, the work comes to you a bit more. Same with relationship with the land. The more I've started to build my relationship with the land and find ways to give back to the land, give back to the waters, and have that become more reciprocal, the more that has been steering my work. And that has been steering the way that I interact and build relationships. And so I can't remember which elder at Trent said this, but there was a woman who said, take it one day at a time and start with yourself. And that has really been true for me in developing my understanding about this process. The statement I said at the beginning there about not getting in the way is a little bit harder. I'm still figuring that out. But I think what Paul was saying about our culture being quick to act, slowing down and really making sure as organizations and as individuals that we take the time to be critical about our actions and really question if we should be occupying that space, or if we should be applying for those funds, or if we should be contributing to X, Y, or Z is really important as a practice and difficult to develop.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I've just been thinking too, because for me, I'm so grateful for those two signposts. They've become just like a touchstone for even when I'm thinking about answering any of these questions, that and also the notion of allyship, once again, potentially isn't necessarily for us to define either. That once again, this is like a towards movement. This is an endeavoring, an aspiration to be an allyship, and that if we are centering Indigenous sovereignty in our work, if we're really working towards that, all of the ways that we organize the events where we're inviting Indigenous people in shifts and changes, that it's essentially not about us and our objectives at the fore, at the center, that we're centering Indigenous sovereignty. And that starts to formulate. I've just been seeing it and feeling it myself. And as we're inviting and hosting different kinds of events and initiatives and campaigns, like how is it that we can center that, not just have it as an add-on or a like a representation, that it becomes the center. And once again, in terms of our relationship, deepening our personal relationship with water, part of that practice is that, as I understand it, is that as we deepen our personal relationship with water, we have access, we have greater access to the intelligence of water herself, and that our working towards allyship will become more clear to us because we are in relationship with that what we're working towards, what we're working. So I think once again, I'm so glad for those gifts of those signposts. They often kind of like that just helps me distill it down to some nuggets.
Mhm.
I'll just add one more piece, thanks you too, is I'm a bit of a cultural studies person, and language is important, as Hannah mentioned at the top. And so I think part of the question for me reads around this notion of like stay in your lane and like knowing what your lane is and not crossing over and speaking on behalf of another nation or another people's. And I think that's important to distinguish versus being in response to, taking the ability to respond. And so for me, and I had a lot of experience with this with the Great Lakes Commons work, and we had a Commons Charter and the whole bit. And it's so wanting to speak to the whole. But and this is back to my point regarding positionality. For me, two of the most problematic words in some of these campaigns and efforts I see regarding decolonization or water work is the word we or the word our. I think we really should be grounded in who we're speaking about and on behalf of and in response to, because I think staying in your lane is a powerful trust building relationship, but shouldn't be used as a excuse or deflection from taking responsibility.
I'll add one more comment here. I think, Lindsay, the second half of the question was about what can we do to support each other in this learning. And so I want to offer two easy ways. And the first is supporting each other in learning by distributing resources. One of the ways I really seek to contribute to this conversation is by sharing the things that really inform my understanding. And so a lot of work has already been done by Indigenous folks in recording conversations like this, and they're out there. And so we can do that listening without requesting more educational time. And then the second is, some of the most vulnerable places to have these conversations is with our families. And Thanksgiving is coming up, and everyone has that inappropriate uncle. And so it's really important to ask these questions, use our gift of wanting to ask questions in uncomfortable places and start to trigger these conversations in areas where they aren't already being triggered.
I really appreciate all those thoughts that have been shared, and it's definitely something that's come up for me as well. And I appreciate that a lot of these conversations can be kind of destabilizing when you're first getting into them and anxiety inducing, like Paul was mentioning. And so, I think for all of us here, community has been a huge part of that, and finding the things that ground us in that moment that enable us to move forward. Kind of building off that last question, but a little bit more specific, was around this work in how it shows up in water. So how do settler groups working towards water protection specifically, how can they carry out appropriate consultation without burdening Indigenous people? So kind of taking that general theme that I think you all touched on so beautifully, but specifically in the work of water.
I'll just start with, for anybody on the call who's been working with me these last couple of years with the Sisters of St. Joseph, trying to broaden the idea of a territorial acknowledgement into a land and water acknowledgement. And so that way we are equally recognizing the treaties and the indigenous territories that we occupy, but we are in allyship or in kinship with creation herself. And so an acknowledgement of the gifts of the lands and the waters, particularly the waters for individuals and for water organizations that work on water, of course, to be part of the water body, to be part of the watershed, and to include that in your private and public acknowledgements.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I think one that we necessarily give an awful lot of thought to, and I can't say that I have a perfectly clear answer for it yet either. Part of the process is being really willing, as Paul was saying, to just be willing to take some risks, engage in relationships, ask questions. We will make quote unquote mistakes along the way, meaning we may not do things perfectly, and that's not a reason to not do them. We have to take care, and we have to go slowly in terms of how we build relationships with Indigenous people on whose lands we are enacting some kind of water advocacy. It is really important, I think, to take the time to make those relationships part of our work. So it's necessarily going to take a long time, and we're in this tension all the time with water watchers. So, for example, a grassroots group might formulate around, let's say, a quarry that's happening in their neighborhood, and perhaps there are no built relationships at that point in time, and there's a timeline on the quarry, and so there's questions and challenges around this that I'm not sure that I have a clear answer to at all, other than that at every single meeting it can come up. We can start with a living land and water acknowledgement, and have that be our grounding for the work that we are bringing into this. And from that will percolate the ways that we can build those relationships, and over time, at the speed of trust, bring perspectives into it. What we cannot do is look to an Indigenous person to join our cause, and sort of like as a silver bullet way to get the project wrapped up and completed. That feels like more harm being created. So it's a gentle process and a slow process, and one that is going to take time, and possibly sometimes we just need to get the quarry stopped if it's a tight timeline. But it doesn't mean we can't do both of those things in tandem, that we can't also be working towards and building relationships, because ultimately I think, and I believe, that we can be seen as working towards a common goal if our interests genuinely are about protecting the groundwater, that we are working towards a common goal, and we will be seen that way if we're coming from that intention. So it's a tricky question, and one we come across all the time and have to juggle often. And I imagine that over time, as we're doing the work to build relationships, as we're doing the work to personally decolonize and build our relationship with water, it will just naturally become more integrated in all of those campaigns or advocacy scenarios or issues. It'll just be more interwoven from the outset.
Interwoven is a good word. It's challenging to move to that place, but as the vast majority of these conversations I've experienced have been centered on this topic. I don't tend to hear very many of my water colleagues weave these themes and this unlearning process into the rest of our work. Thus far, it seems to me at least that decolonization has been this separate kind of topic that we talk about, and then it doesn't translate into the rest of the water work that we do. And so that interwoven word really resonates with me. What I will offer from an Our Living Waters standpoint is that when you're working for the waters, you can work at multiple scales and on topics. And so, Wellington Water Watchers works in a specific place, in a specific territory with specific Indigenous neighbors. And Our Living Waters works across the country from coast to coast to coast. And the majority of the network members that we work with come from organizations that are also non-Indigenous. So for us, our role in this work has been less about forming strong Indigenous relations. We do have some Indigenous people on different water projects, but they tend to be strong relations of those who are working in that watershed or in that place. And so we have had to take a step back and be really firm in our position and know that our responsibility is more about supporting and asking these questions and offering the education to our non-Indigenous peers. And so we've been finding ways to try to interweave that into the rest of our work and not have it be standalone conversations, but a day-to-day, every meeting, how can we ask a question or change our practices or facilitate differently so that some of these learnings transfer through into our day-to-day work with the water.
I'll have one more thought from my end. I think going from the general to the water world in particular, I love the sort of the phrase I saw online, like, we are not protecting the environment, we are part of the living earth protecting herself. And for me, I work on water issues for many reasons, but one of them is water, because we are mostly water ourselves. The human body and the water body really break down the binaries that, let's say, Arlene was talking about, or this sort of disenchantment that I spoke about before. You may notice that in my personal introduction, I situated myself within a larger water body. And so I do think the water nonprofits or water researchers, water educators, people interested in protecting water have a very unique ability to decolonize and be allies, because water herself is at play here. Through, again, many of the teachers I mentioned at the beginning, a phrase that I've been dwelling on lately is that, we're not decolonizing water protection necessarily, but water, and from my context, the Great Lakes, water is decolonizing us. And I think that is a huge shift that goes far beyond decolonization. It's an initiation into a larger conversation, a longer sense of what it means to be a human being. And there is a lot of potential for the sacredness of water to align Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, because water fulfills that role in many rituals and social bonds. And I feel like there is a groundswell of potential to move past current divides or current boundaries when it comes to what is water, what are we, what is water protection and advocacy.
I want to pick up and offer one more practice tactic based on things you were saying about building relationships as part of our work, whether relations to water, relations to peoples. But one thing I've heard, it works really well across board in organizations. If this is something that matters to you in your organization, this is something we need to be attributing value to in the way of time and budget. And so if we want to be showing up for community events and showing up to spend time with the waters and doing this unlearning internally. Like we have attributed time internally at our organization to hold ourselves accountable, to be having these conversations and challenging ourselves to practice differently. Without those accountability measures, it can be hard to ensure that the practices evolve.
Yeah, thanks. That's beautiful. There's so many beautiful things being said here that I'm so pleased to be hearing. And one other thing that just came up as you were thinking that too. So, and I know I often hear Paul talk about this, that in our work, you know, again, back to the short-term kind of thing that's happening in our community that we need to get stopped right away. We are necessarily working in and within the colonial structures. We are working and assigning, for what it's worth, authority to those colonial structures within that paradigm. But to be working again, not like in tandem, to recognize that water governance has been here and in place on these lands from time immemorial, and is held and stewarded by the original peoples of these lands, and you know, arguably have a deeper authority around what water governance should look like, could look like. So again, just keeping that in mind. I think again, so much of colonization is this duality and this either or, and just holding it all, like holding the idea that for the time being, we are working to influence policy that can, you know, immediately be improving the health and quality of water, but that ultimately there's an authority that we can defer to, or we can lift up, rather, we can work to lift up in our work. So.
Those were some very well-spoken points. Thank you. I think you covered a lot of the points where I thought, oh, this will connect to our next question, and they just more and more kind of weave this web. So in terms of, you know, everything we talked about with tokenism, with, you know, really showing up, really being there, what are the right ways to show up? Tomorrow is the first annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. So tomorrow, September 3rd, we'll honor the children, survivors, families, and communities affected by residential schools. So we did have a question of if it is tokenism to wear an orange shirt tomorrow in order to support the Every Child Matters campaign. As well, if we're just, you know, opening up this conversation about tokenism, how can we encourage our peers to move beyond those token actions and towards allyship and true meaningful allyship? I think you did touch on some of it already, but more in regards of our present climate and especially moving into tomorrow.
I don't have much to say on this. I think I've said most of my answer in previous questions. I do feel it's important to be aware of what tokenism is and performative allyship or performative politics, but without knowing the circumstances or the positionality of each person, it's really hard. And so I would just return to my ideas regarding being grounded, unsettling yourself and your larger circle, and trying to listen and learn, and what the performance of that becomes would be authentic. That's all.
Yeah. I might just say too that, again, just from a really personal journey process, you know, when I first was looking into doing a land acknowledgement, there was a significant learning that occurred for me in doing the research to be able to properly post a land acknowledgement. And I know that there's a risk of land acknowledgements becoming rote and ineffectual and tokenistic and not deeply meaningful. And so the requirement on my part to avoid that is to continue my learning journey, to continue making that land acknowledgement richer and deeper and more reflective of where I'm at each point in the journey. So again, I as Paul says, without knowing the positionality, there's no yes or no to that particular question. It's like, where are you on in the journey? if wearing an, if coming to the notion of wearing an orange shirt is a significant part of where you are at on your journey of learning what that means, and you're wearing it in that context, you have my blessing on that one. But yeah, so again, just to take care around it. Where are you at on your journey? Wearing your orange shirt, if that's maybe all you do, then maybe consider doing a little bit more work, a little bit more research, a little bit more exploration personally. So.
I have nothing further to add.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's going to be, obviously this conversation we're having today is intentionally settler-led and for a settler audience, but there's so many incredible resources and events and showcases of art and storytelling that we encourage everyone to kind of check out tomorrow as well. And there's so many different resources available online. A simple Google can bring you to a lot of different pages where you can continue to deepen that learning journey. The following question that I'm bringing up, I think we kind of touched on a little bit. And again, I think that comes to the truth of the matter that everything's related and everything's connected. There is no binary. But the question was, what are ways in which you, from your own learning, now see approaches to water advocacy or protection as showing evidence of colonization? Are there specific actions, undertakings, or language, etc., that we aren't getting at yet? And I know Taylor talked about this a little bit, where sometimes we'll talk about water work and decolonizing work as separate issues, and that kind of idea of interweaving them together. And I know that we've kind of touched on this topic a little bit, so I'll put that question out, but then also maybe encourage you each to speak from personal experience. Maybe there's examples in your own relationships where you've seen colonization pop up, whether internally or externally within that water work you're doing. And if you need me to repeat the question, let me know.
Can you repeat the heart of it?
Yes. Are there ways that you see, are there approaches to water advocacy or protection that you see as evidence of showing evidence of colonization? Or are there specific areas in water advocacy that we just aren't getting at yet?
I'll just, before I forget, there's I don't have a deep one, but more is I've seen environmental and water advocacy being done that I would categorize as within a colonial framework, when it is referring to and conceptualizing the environment for its use and needs for humans in general, and for settlers in particular, regarding recreation and beautifulness. And so it's I've seen that come up even the last couple of months, and I feel like we need to go deeper into a non-human centered approach to why protecting spaces and waterways is important. And we need to, obviously integrate the land and water acknowledgements that we've been asked to learn about and activate. So that would be a quick answer.
One aspect of the work that I feel emerging a little bit, but I think could be far stronger, and we have a lot of work to do on it, is the embodied work of decolonization. And so in my experience, just speaking very personally, this work of sitting in intercultural spaces and doing very vulnerable unlearning, I feel it in my nervous system, and I feel it in my body and in my heart. Yet most of us from a Western worldview speak about this subject from our objective cognitive minds. And so coming into our body, into our nervous system, and allowing those other ways of knowing to come through in speaking about this and practicing this is really important and really difficult. I am perpetually amazed by the resilience of Indigenous knowledge holders and elders that continue to show up and continue to offer, despite everything that comes with them in their nervous systems. And so my understanding is that folks who have benefited from our structural society, people who have been in a position of privilege for a long time, haven't been tested in their nervous system in the same way. So we need to be developing resilience in our bodies to be participating in this. And I'll stop there.
That's super
Did
important.
that make any sense?
Totally,
Okay.
it totally makes sense. Yeah, it really resonates. And that makes me think too, that often I hear the accusation, and I believe it as well, that in the environmental movement, there is a tendency to be particularly like preachy too. And this touches a little bit on that, maybe even from a different side of it, but that we, in our invitation to, because I see a lot in our collective water advocacy work, that it is, so much of it is centered, almost like so much of it is centered on colonial structures, colonial ways of being. And so to actively get in there, for all of us to activate that, is going to require this tension on our nervous system that Taylor speaks about, and that we also equally can hold it in a way that isn't preachy, that we can make it always invitations, but be persistent in our inviting of these conversations to deepen our collective learning, right? So in every meeting, I'd love it if in every meeting it's like, I wonder, whose land are we on? Maybe just even as a beginning part, if there's a lack of a living land acknowledgement at the beginning, that should come in. It could. There I go again with my preachiness. I can't help it. It's in my being. So just part of the colonization. So, how can we be provocateurs? How can we, in this way that invites our systems into this tension, but doesn't just spin us out in white privilege, I guess maybe is what I want to say.
I would just add, as an example or a way in which I see this play out is so often water campaigns ask people to sign up to a list so then they can be emailed, or they're asked to give money or sign a petition to the settler government, which are all important. When I was involved with the Great Lakes Commons Charter process, Commons Charter, and the work I've done in different ways since, what is the petition we're asking people to do to develop their own relationship with water? How are we actually asking ourselves to do things that our governments are not doing? And this has been related to a conversation we had earlier regarding, let's say a group wants the government to recognize Indigenous rights more, and this maybe this white or this settler Canadian NGO would like to see the government implement UNDRIP or take care of the drinking water advisories. And that's an important advocacy piece for this, let's say this NGO, but how is this NGO also incorporating Indigenous rights and drinking water and Indigenous water teachings, Indigenous water law into its mandate, into its campaigns? And so I think we need to balance asking governments to do things and also asking ourselves as Canadians to actually live those things as well. From my experience, most politicians or leaders don't lead, they follow. And I think it's up to Canadians and those who identify as Canadians to actually start to animate these invitations and these petitions to our relationship with water, to Indigenous laws, to decolonial allyship. And that's, I think, going to get us to the kind of water relationships we need.
That's a great point, Paul. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because that was our last question right here. I think just tying together everything we've talked about, it's important to really recognize the lack of access to clean drinking water in many Indigenous communities, and just where that intersects with the work that we're all looking to do. How does it interact with that reality, decolonizing our work? You know, you started that conversation a bit, Paul, so if anyone else wants to kind of jump in and any last thoughts with that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So, you know, and it's one that I sit with often, you know, as an organization that works towards water advocacy. And to me, the most glaring water issue is the one just mentioned. And yeah, how do we maybe I'm going to back it up to something that I think that I heard Taylor said. In what ways are we devoting time and resources to this work within our organization? So whether it's specifically the boiled water advisories, or whether it's like our work on you know, maybe even backing it up, just our active work on conversations and decolonizing our work. And I can give you know, a very specific example with us and our organization working to support, and this has arisen really naturally over the years, but to support the calls of clan mothers and youth and elders from the Confederacy Council at Six Nations, who, you know, boiled water advisories, lack of adequate access to drinking water right there on Six Nations, which is an hour south of the Nestle, now Blue Triton headquarters, national headquarters. You know, there was an action last Friday too that invited people to come in support of the renewal of the cease and desist order from the elders and youth from Six Nations. And there were some of us settler treaty people who showed up to support that call. And whether we could physically in person or supporting it in an online context, those are really great ways to I believe that was a powerful event to be at and to participate in. And the understanding of the way those issues weave together, there's a reason why there is a request and a call for that land to be returned to Six Nations or to Indigenous peoples in general who are suffering from an access to clean potable water because of failures of our colonial structures. There's a natural tie-in in that one. And I think that as we deepen our work in decolonizing, we will encounter more of those natural ties to be able to actually center the Indigenous sovereignty piece.
I think we should end on that note. My take is not as hopeful. So yeah, I think I'll just tell a story. I'm supposed to go to dinner tonight at Curve Lake upriver, which is the First Nation upriver from us here in Nogojiwanong. And on the invitation, it's a reminder of what to bring for this backyard barbecue, was a reminder to bring your own drinking water, because Curve Lake has been on a boil water advisory for a long time, despite having all the hydrological and engineering studies complete, the whole system of water treatment is designed. They just need the finances. They need the federal support to build it. And so it feels intentional. It feels intentional, and I'm filled with rage and anger, and I feel it in my body that there are people living on the same river in the same climate who don't have equal access to drinking water, clean water. And so I don't see very many solutions. I like sitting with people who are a bit more optimistic, but when you talk to people who live on reserve, who don't drink anything but bottled water, it's really real. Either of you want to say anything to that?
actually really appreciate you bringing that up, Taylor, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to talk about hope and action and movement. In a lot of ways, that's a privilege that we hold because we aren't directly impacted in some of these cases. So making space for rage, for anger, for sadness, I think that that's really important and intentional in all this work, especially when you're in community or building community. So as much as it isn't that, you know, hopeful wrap up that's like everyone's craving, like I think that's really important, and that's really important space that I think you just shared. So I really appreciate that personally, and I think that's important to acknowledge in this work. It's not all rainbows and butterflies and hope, and we're moving on this beautiful journey together. There are some real issues and emotions that come up related to that. So I appreciate you for bringing that up. That's given us a lot to reflect on and think about. Being conscious of the time, it's 4:27, so I think we'll slowly end that conversation for today, but clearly this is a conversation that could go on for much, much longer. And we hope that it does. We hope that you continue to bring this conversation outwards into your own spaces and your own communities. I think in this conversation, what's been really rich for me has been thinking about the idea of identity and at the same time community. So how are we paying attention to ourselves when things show up for us that maybe we don't sit right with us? How do we pay attention to our nervous system? How do we ground ourselves? But similarly, how do we recognize kind of who we are and how that fits in with the community that we're a part of? And maybe we find grounding in that community, and maybe that community is a place where we can offer education or offer conversation or support. So those two concepts really resonated in listening in this conversation. So I really appreciate all three of you for sharing that. We've had a lot of questions come in, and we got to a lot of them. We didn't get to all of them, but I just want to let everyone know that if we didn't directly answer your question here today, we do have a record of them, and we'll be holding them and considering them carefully for future conversations and reflecting back on them. Of course, we encourage you to have those questions, to ask those questions elsewhere and with us. And finally, I guess before turning it over to Hannah, obviously tomorrow is September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So again, spend some time tomorrow and whatever, oh, it's just us. Spend some time tomorrow kind of reflecting on that and engaging in those ways. There's a lot of incredible Indigenous voices that are going to be highlighted and centered, and there's lots of incredible resources on how you can support that work moving forward. So I'll pass it over to Hannah for some concluding thoughts, but thank you all.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thank you, Arlene, Taylor, and Paul. That was a important note to end on, Taylor, for sure. I do analyze water samples as part of my research, and I think you get so caught up in the work of, you know, in my case, doing a master's degree and writing my thesis, that when I step back and see that, you know, these water samples are just drinking water, but you know, it's brown, it's not drinkable. It's really sad reality to think that, you know, that privilege isn't there. But then, you know, to use our privilege that we do have in whatever space we come from, whatever background we come from, and support that water advocacy in a respectful and meaningful way. I really appreciate when Paul says moving at the speed of trust. I think that's really important, and trust will always be kind of the center of what we do given the history. And if you have any more questions about that, or if you need to educate yourself more, depending on where you're at with your journey, we can always stand to learn more. Tomorrow's really a great day to do that. Be kind with all those around you. Think about those affected by tomorrow in a more personal capacity, but we really encourage you to make space for that tomorrow. That's the purpose of that day. As well, we intentionally, of course, held this conversation to really hopefully, you know, spark some conversations for tomorrow. Taylor pointed out, you know, over the holidays with your family, have those uncomfortable conversations, but we really did want to move out of the way for tomorrow and allow for a lot of these Indigenous-led, whether it's art or education or whatever events are going on. I think Lindsay mentioned, you know, simple Google search, but also at Water Watchers, I'm sure we'll post some resources. So feel free to reach out to us as well. I'm just really grateful to have moderated this with Lindsay. Thank you so much. And then I'll pass it back to Megan to give some final words.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I think I can speak for all of us here listening. Just a huge thank you to you, Arlene, Taylor, and Paul, as well as Hannah and Lindsay for taking this time to deepen this conversation towards decolonizing settler-led advocacy and protection. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your knowledge and your learnings with us, and a huge thank you to our moderators for bringing those great questions forward. I also want to give a big thank you to Danny Lindemood, who is working hard behind the scenes to make sure that this event has run smoothly, and that all of your questions have been documented so we can address them later on. And of course, a huge thank you to all of you here who are joining us today as we work towards building this conversation, the first of many conversations on an important topic. And oh, thank you, Danny. Perfect. So we invite you to all continue this conversation to deepen the conversation through a few next steps. And of course, as Hannah and Lindsay have mentioned, tomorrow, we hope that you spend some time with some Indigenous-led activities and learnings, and encourage you all to come to a few follow-up Water Watchers events in the near future. So first, on October 5th, we will be holding a phone zap for collective action. And this is a follow-up action to the Global Climate Strike rally that was held at the Blue Triton Nestle site. And this is an opportunity for digital collective action. We will all be gathering together to contact our representatives and demand that Blue Triton give the bottling plant back to Indigenous people. And this will be held from 7 p.m. till 9 p.m. on October 5th. The next event here, and you can use this QR code here you can scan that with your phone to receive the link to register for Watershed 2021. And Watershed 21 is the second annual Digital People's Water Convention. And this event brings together people organizing for water protection in Ontario. We will be continuing this type of conversation there. And it is also a great opportunity to learn more about water advocacy happening in this region. So again, you can use that QR code to register for that event. And we also ask that you join our newsletter if you're not already. And this is a great way to stay tuned for the next conversation on this topic, and also to learn a little bit more about what's going on with the Water Watchers. And finally, we are compiling a list of resources to share with you, and many of you have shared resources with us through the question and answer box, and thank you so much for doing that. We've collected them all. After this event, you will receive a Google form. So we're going to share that with each and every one of you, and you can submit other resources if you haven't done so through the question and answer box. If they've been useful to you along this journey, please include them so we can send them out to everybody later on this fall. I'm going to just leave the event open for a few moments. So if you had any final questions or any resources that you want to share in the question and answer box, please feel free to do so. And again, we will follow up with the answers to those other questions. Thank you so much to everyone for being here, and to our wonderful moderators and panelists, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you all.
Water, you heal me. Water, let me heal you. Water, take my love. Remember my love. Water, you heal me. Water, let me heal you. Water, know my love. Remember my love. Water, you heal me. Water, let me heal you. Water, hold my love. Remember my